So chapter 24, finance, savings and investments. We had spoken about what we were going to be doing in this chapter and introduced the first few sections. So if you recall, describe and define the flow of funds through financial markets, as well as describe the financial institutions, different types of financial institutions. Explain how investment and savings, along with borrowing and lending decisions, are made. Explain how these decisions interact in the loanable funds market. Explain how a government deficit or a government surplus influences the real interest rate as well as the quantity of saving and investment in the loanable funds market. And explain how international borrowing or lending influences the real interest rate, savings and investments in the global funds market. So we had done the first one, we had done the second one, we had done the third one, but I said we would come back and revise the third one. This is where we'll start today, and then we'll do more discussions about the government's influence on the loanable funds market, as well as international borrowing and lending, so influence of external factors outside of our economy. So after going through a whole lot of definitions, introducing a whole lot of different terminology, we eventually got to the diagram of our loanable funds market. Spoke about demand for loanable funds as well as supply of loanable funds. That's where we'll just pick it up today. If you recall, demand for loanable funds, it's downward sloping if we are plotting quantity of loanable funds against real interest rate. So two factors determine investment and demand for loanable funds. So remember, demand for loanable funds, is essentially the same as investment. Or a more general term for investment would be interest-sensitive expenditure. Interest-sensitive expenditure. So in other words, any kind of spending that is influenced by the interest rate would be interest-sensitive expenditure. Investment is the main kind of spending that is influenced by the interest rate, which is why we usually just refer to investment. But more generally, it's any kind of interest-sensitive expenditure. So the factors that determine investment and those other kinds of interest-sensitive expenditure would be the interest rate, as well as then expected profits primarily concerned with investment. So the demand for loanable funds, the relationship is downward sloping. In other words, the relationship between the quantity of loanable funds demanded and the real interest rate is negative. Changes in the demand for loanable funds, well, changes in demand would mean it's either shifting to the left or it's shifting to the right. What would cause it to shift to the left or to the right? When expected profits change. Okay? So when we have a change in the expectations about future profits, that shifts our demand curve either to the left or to the right. In other words, a change in expected profits will change the quantity of loanable funds demanded at any given interest rate. That's a shift. The greater the expected profit from new capital, the greater is the amount of investment and the greater the demand for loanable funds. In other words, an increase in expected profits increase, what happens to the demand for loanable funds? Demand for loanable funds shifts to the right. Yeah. Okay. Supply of loanable funds. Supply is upward sloping. In other words, the positive relationship between the quantity of loanable funds supplied and real interest rate. Whereas there were only two factors on the demand side, there are 5 factors on the supply side. So there was only one thing that shifts the demand side. There are 4 things that shift the supply side. changes in current disposable income, changes in expected future income, your current wealth, as well as any default risk that would come with lending your savings to someone. If you have savings and you lend them to someone and you expect them to be a high risk, then you would demand a higher interest rate. And if we bring those two together, then we have the market for loanable funds. So loanable funds market, and our equilibrium is where supply and demand intersect. So equilibrium in the loanable funds market. There is one real interest rate at which the quantity of loanable funds demanded and the quantity supplied are equal, and that interest rate is the equilibrium real interest rate. So at equilibrium, we don't have a shortage and we don't have a surplus. At an interest rate above our equilibrium interest rate, we would have a surplus of loanable funds. At an interest rate below equilibrium, we would have a shortage of loanable funds. Okay, so any questions at this point? This is our second macroeconomic model that we've dealt with. The first one that we dealt with was the labor market, and connected to the labor market was the production function. So that was our first model. And then this is our second one, is the loanable funds market. Okay. At this point in time, we're at two separate markets. We haven't dealt with how they might overlap, but we will talk later in the course about bringing them together along with a whole lot of other diagrams. So what happens in that market when there are changes in demand and supply? If you have an increase in demand, for example, if profits that firms expect to earn increase, they increase their planned investment, and demand for loanable funds, which are needed to finance that investment, will increase. With this increase, but no change in the supply of loanable funds, there would be a shortage of funds at current interest rates. As borrowers compete for funds, the interest rate rises and lenders increase the quantity of funds supplied. So let's show what that looks like diagrammatically. We're saying here's our current demand and supply relationship with equilibrium at an interest rate of 6%. If there was an increase in demand for loanable funds, our demand curve shifts from demand 0 to demand 1. At current equilibrium interest rates of 6%, what do we find? There is a shortage. The quantity of loanable funds demanded, so the quantity demanded would correspond to some amount here, is much greater than the quantity supplied. Okay, this is the shortage. When there's a shortage because demand exceeds supply, what happens? The price in the loanable funds market is determined by the real interest rate, or the real interest rate, shall we say, is the price. So when you have demand exceeding supply, what happens to prices? Prices increase, exactly. So our interest rate starts to increase. As the interest rate increases, the quantity of loanable funds supplied starts increasing. As the interest rate increases, the quantity of loanable funds demanded starts decreasing. And as the supply increases and demand decreases, eventually we end up at a new equilibrium point. Whoops. And I cannot actually draw one. Well, anyway, we end up at a new equilibrium point here. So that was what our little statement here was describing. With an increase, okay, so if profits are increasing, there's an increase in demand. Profits increase, demand increases. With that increase and no change in the supply, there is a shortage of funds. So we have a shortage of funds. There's a shortage of funds. Borrowers compete for funds. What happens? The interest rate rises and lenders increase the quantity of funds supplied. So as interest rates rise, quantity supplied increases and quantity demanded decreases until we end up at a new equilibrium, and our new equilibrium would correspond with a higher new equilibrium interest rate. If we have an increase in supply, so instead of our demand curve shifting, our supply curve shifts to the right. If the supply curve shifts to the right, at our initial equilibrium interest rate, would we have a shortage or would we have a surplus of funds? We would have a surplus of funds. In other words, there would be too many funds supplied, right? The quantity supplied would be greater than the quantity demanded at the initial equilibrium interest rate. What then happens to the equilibrium interest rate? Pressure on that interest rate to fall, to go down. As the interest rate goes down, the quantity of loanable funds demanded would increase. The quantity of loanable funds supplied would decrease until eventually that surplus was eliminated. Okay. So that's exactly what it's describing here. If one of the influences on savings plans changes and increases savings, the supply of loanable funds increases. With no change in the demand for loanable funds, the market has a large amount of loanable funds available, or a surplus. Borrowers find bargains and lenders find themselves accepting a lower interest rate. At the lower interest rate, borrowers find additional investment projects profitable and increase the quantity of loanable funds that they borrow. And in the long run, what happens? Well, over time, both demand and supply in the loanable funds market will fluctuate, and the real interest rate both rises and falls depending on what's happening to demand or supply. Both the supply of loanable funds and the demand for loanable funds tend to increase generally over time. Which one is increasing more will determine whether the interest rate is tending to go up or tending to go down. If demand is increasing faster than supply, we would see interest rates going up. If supply was increasing faster than demand, interest rates would be going down. Cool. What happens then when the government gets involved in the loanable funds markets? So here we're going to talk about, first of all, a budget surplus. What is a budget surplus? That means that the government is getting in more revenue than what it is spending on outlays, right? So a budget surplus means they've got extra money that they don't need, right? So we could say that government spending was less than the amount that it was receiving in taxes or other revenues. So the way that it describes it in this particular textbook is to say that the supply of loanable funds increases. In other words, if T minus G is positive, that's a form of savings, right? So we have an increase in the supply of loanable funds. Government will use that money to invest. It will lend that money to investors. So let's take a look at our initial equation that we did last week, just to remind you. Remember, what kind of savings do we have? We can have savings from the private sector, from households. We can have savings from the government, and we can have savings from the rest of the world. All of those kinds of savings can fund our investments. So at the moment we're talking about a government surplus, so it's savings from the government. So if government has savings, that can increase the supply of loanable funds. The increase in the supply of loanable funds does what? It decreases the interest rate. Okay? Decrease in the interest rate leads to what? A movement down our demand for loanable funds curve and an increase in the quantity of loanable funds borrowed or lent, right? So in other words, an increase in the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds exchanged in the market, which means we have a higher level of investment. Yeah? Remember, demand for loanable funds is determined primarily by investment. As we move down our loanable funds curve, as we are borrowing more money, we are investing in more products. Okay? So if we're moving from our initial equilibrium point here, call it A, and we move down to our new equilibrium point B, because our supply of loanable funds has increased, moving from point A to point B, the quantity of loanable funds has increased. Okay? With an increase in quantity of loanable funds, we have an increase in investment, which is what it says here. Increase in investment. So the real interest rate falls, which decreases household savings and decreases the quantity of private funds supplied, but the lower real interest rate increases the quantity of loanable funds demanded and therefore increases investment. So what does this little point here mean? If we compare, this is our initial supply of savings. At our initial equilibrium interest rates, the quantity supplied and demanded had a value of 2 billion. Okay? With an increase in government savings, that amount increased from 2 billion to 3 billion. In other words, we had a 1 billion increase. Sorry, that doesn't look very good. A 1 billion rand increase in savings. What happens as the interest rate goes down? We have a movement to the left along our supply curve. In other words, as interest rates go down, the quantity of loanable funds supply decreases. Happy with that? Are you happy with that? That decrease in interest rates and decrease in supply of loanable funds is what we're describing here. The real interest rate falls, which decreases household savings and decreases the quantity of private funds supplied. Okay? So compared to our initial equilibrium interest rate, there was an increase in government savings, but then because of that increase in government savings, we have a surplus in funds available. Because of a surplus in funds available, there's downward pressure on interest rates. As interest rates fall, people decide to save less, and as they save less, we have a movement along the supply curve. Remember, what determines a movement along a demand or a supply curve? Changes in price level. If the y-axis changes, if the value of the y-axis changes, we have a movement along the demand and supply curves. So that's a government budget surplus as described in this textbook. If you look at a different textbook, you might find that they describe a budget surplus not as a shift to the right in the supply curve, but as a shift to the left in the demand curve. And the shift in the left to the demand curve, if we were to show it on the same diagram, would correspond to a level of demand going through this point over here where we have the same equilibrium interest rate. We would just have a different quantity of loanable funds. And whether the demand curve shifts or the supply curve shifts just depends on what you assume the government is doing with its surplus funds, or what you assume about how it finances its spending generally. Either way, whether you're using this textbook or a different textbook, when you have a government surplus, you will always have a decrease in interest rates. Okay? And with a decrease in interest rates, you will have an increase in private investment. Any questions at this point? Okay, you guys happy? Yeah. Do you mean the demand for loanable funds curve or some other demand curve? This one here. As the interest rate decreases, we have a movement along a demand or a supply curve, right? And investment is the demand side of the loanable funds market. Okay? So as interest rates go down, we have a movement to the right along our demand curve. Yeah? Movement to the right along the demand curve means an increase in investment. So the lower interest rate means an increase in investment, movement along the demand for loanable funds curve. Does that answer your question? Okay. So the reason that I just mentioned the fact that a government budget surplus can also be shown as a shift to the left of the demand curve is because this textbook then describes a government deficit as a shift to the right of the demand curve. Okay? Which seems a little bit schizophrenic to me, but that's the way they've chosen to do it. So if you have a government budget deficit, your demand for loanable funds shifts to the right. Again, you might see some textbooks describing a government budget deficit as instead a shift to the left in the supply curve. So just to sort of bring some clarity to that, what I'm saying is a budget surplus, we can describe that as a shift to the right in the supply curve, a surplus, or a budget deficit as a shift to the left in the supply curve. Okay? So government budget deficit, shift to the left in the supply curve. Government budget deficit, shift to the right in the supply curve. Or we can describe a government budget deficit as a shift to the right in the demand curve and a government budget surplus as a shift to the left in the demand curve. You with me? So that just, whether it's a surplus or a deficit, just means the opposite movement in one of those curves. Okay? So they've chosen to describe a government deficit as a movement in demand, whereas a government surplus, they're showing it as a movement in supply. I'm not sure why, but that's what they've decided to do. So government budget deficit, movement to the right in the demand for loanable funds. Why? Because remember, a government deficit, G greater than T. Okay? Which means that government is spending more than it's getting in revenues. If it's spending more than it's getting in revenues, it must be borrowing. If it's borrowing, it could be entering the loanable funds market and demanding loanable funds. Remember, usually we would say that demand for loanable funds is determined by investment. Okay? But if government is spending more than it's getting in revenue, it will also be entering the loanable funds market and demanding loanable funds. What happens, right? An increase in the demand for loanable funds compared to our initial equilibrium interest rate, what would happen? We would have a shortage. If there was a shortage, what happens? There's upward pressure on interest rates. As interest rates increase, the quantity of loanable funds supplied increases. We have a movement to the right along our supply curve. As interest rates increase, we have a movement to the left along the demand for loanable funds curve, and the quantity of loanable funds demanded will decrease as the interest rate increases. So a government budget deficit increases the demand for loanable funds, the real interest rate rises, which increases household savings and increases the quantity of private funds supplied. Both the higher real interest rate decreases investment and the quantity of loanable funds demanded by firms to finance investment, right? So, as interest rates increase, we have a movement to the left along the demand curve. Movement to the left means a decrease in investment. Got it? What we'll see later in the course is that has interesting effects. We call that crowding out. In other words, an increase in government spending causes interest rates to increase. The increase in government spending therefore causes a decrease in investment spending. Right? So government spending goes up, but because government spending goes up, investment spending goes down. So the government spending pushes the investment spending out by making interest rates go higher. When it pushes the investment spending out of the market, then we call that crowding out. So the crowding out effect, the tendency for a government budget deficit to raise the real interest rate and decrease investment. The budget deficit crowds out investment by competing with businesses for scarce financial capital. Okay? That obviously has interesting implications for an economy, because if we're entering into a recession, one of the things we could do is say, well, if we're entering into a recession, we need to somehow try and boost the economy. We can boost the economy by increasing government spending. In other words, government enters into the economy, spends money on goods and services, and that prevents the recession, or shall we say it stops the recession, or at least it generates demand for goods and services, which then generates supply of goods and services. In other words, as long as people are buying goods and services, firms are happy to sell them, and they're happy to produce them. So if no one is buying those goods and services, firms won't produce them. So we have a recession. If government comes in and buys those goods and services, firms are happy to produce them, right? If they're happy to produce them, then we're dealing with the recession. We're stopping the problem, which was the fact that we're not producing anything. But if government enters into the market and starts buying these things, not only does it buy these things, which is good, it also decreases investment, which is then bad. So how do we deal with that, or how does that work? And that's a very cool kind of question that we'll deal with once we put everything together in our big model. So we will come back to that question. Of course, there's an argument that says maybe the crowding out effect actually isn't that important and doesn't really matter, because, and we have something called the Ricardo Barreiro effect. And what that says is that the government budget, whether in surplus or deficit, has no effect on either the real interest rate or investments. Why? Well, let's step through the process. If government has a deficit, that increases demand. So demand shifts to the right. But because demand is shifting to the right, rational taxpayers will say the following: government is increasing spending today. If they are increasing spending today, at some point they will have to pay that back. They're going into debt today. They will have to finance that in the future, which means they would have to raise taxes in the future to pay. When they raise taxes in the future, what is that going to do to my income in the future? It's going to decrease my income in the future, exactly, right? And if I expect my income in the future to go down, what should I do today? I should save more. Remember, if I expect my income to go down in the future, I need to save more of my income today to be able to spend in the future. Okay? So, what will these rational taxpayers do if they see that the government is running a budget deficit today? The increase in demand is accompanied by an increase in supply as people save more. In which case we might have no effect on the interest rate. In which case, no effect on investment spending. Okay? Interesting argument. And so at that point, we can have a brief interlude and look at a question. Okay. Okay, let's have a chat. Number one, with the looming downgrade in South Africa's credit rating, we can expect the interest rates on government bonds to increase. If the interest rate increases, that will increase the price of those bonds. So two aspects of it. The first has to do with obviously credit rating. Credit rating has to do with your level of risk. So if something becomes more risky, we would expect that the interest rates on those bonds would increase, true or false? Okay, so we're happy with that. If the interest rate goes up, then we expect the price of the bonds to go up as well. Yes or no? No. How's it? How you doing, man? Yeah, that's on. Sorry. Okay, so number two, the second part. If the interest rate goes up, what happens to the price of a bond? Goes down. Remember the discussion that we had last week about the inverse relationship between interest rates and no? Let me okay, tell you what. I can tell you what we'll do is take an early break and hopefully get this sorted out, then we'll finish doing this question and carry on. Okay.